Imagine you could take, like, the entire populations of North America, Europe, and South America combined, just all of them.
Right, which is a staggering amount of people.
It's huge.
Yeah.
Now, force all of them to pack up their ancestral farms, abandon their livestock, and move into newly poured concrete cities. And oh yeah, you have to do all of that in just a single human lifetime.
Yeah, it sounds like a pitch for a sci-fi movie, honestly.
It really does. But it isn't a sci-fi premise. That is the exact literal data of what the developing world has actually done over the last 50 years.
It is genuinely the most massive, rapid reorganization of human beings in the history of our species. I mean, we are talking about fundamentally rewiring the human experience for the vast majority of the people on Earth.
And that is exactly our mission for this deep dive. We're looking at a really striking, honestly, a kind of ruthless collection of data today. It's entirely sourced from the World Bank's World Development Indicators.
Yeah, the LMY data set specifically.
Yeah. Right, tracking the half-century evolution of low- and middle-income countries.
Yeah.
And for you listening right now, I really want to set the scene of what we're looking at, because the visual presentation of this report is, well, it's so incredibly stark.
It's very minimalist, very academic.
Exactly. There are absolutely no flashy 3D graphics here. It's all pure white backgrounds, these flat 2D charts. And it uses these really low saturation, almost Morandy colors. So we're talking muted slate blues, ash greens, deep reds, no neon.
Right, it's just data at its most beautiful and, ruthless. The data ink ratio is maxed out.
Yeah, there's no fluff.
Mm-hmm.
But why should you, the listener, care about this specific data set?
Well, because it is crucial to understand that LMYs, these low and middle income countries, they are not some niche subcategory of the global economy. They contain the overwhelming majority of humanity.
Right.
So the story we are unpacking today, this is the definitive story of the modern human race. It's the story of how most people on Earth actually live, how they survive, and how they grow.
It really is. We get so caught up in the news cycle, you know?
Oh, absolutely. When we talk about global history, we tend to get completely distracted by the geopolitical noise. The changing borders, the rising and falling governments, the wars.
Right, the stuff that makes the headline.
Exactly. But beneath all of that noise, there's this silent tectonic shift in the actual data of human existence. And you really cannot understand the global economy without first understanding where the people actually are and the sheer volume of them.
Okay, let's unpack this, because we're moving to the first section of this slide deck.
Yeah.
And the raw human numbers we are dealing with here are just staggering.
They really are.
If we look at this first gray bar chart, we go back 50 years, and the total population in these LNYs was roughly 2 billion people. Today, that number has skyrocketed to over 6.5 billion.
Just pause on that number for a second.
Yeah.
The global system absorbed an additional 4.5 billion people.
It's wild.
It is. That is not just population growth. That is a complete redefinition of the planet's carrying capacity and its economic gravity.
But the raw number is only half the story, right? The more consequential shift, the one that truly breaks my brain when I look at this dual-axis line chart, is the historical flip in where those 6.5 billion people are physically standing.
The urbanization flip.
Yeah. 50 years ago, the developing world was fundamentally agrarian. You see this downward line, over 77.4% of the population lived in rural areas. Today, that rural population has crashed down to 51.5%.
And then you have the other line.
Right. Perfectly intersecting it, moving upward, is the urban population, climbing from 22.5% to nearly half the population, 48.4%. The lines literally cross on the chart. It forms this massive X. And there's this little academic annotation pointing right at it.
That interception point on the X is the exact moment the developing world ceased to be a farming society. It is the moment the center of gravity shifted from the dirt village to the concrete city.
Let's make that physical for a second, because I think it's easy to just look at lines on a graph crossing and move on.
Oh, for sure. It sanitizes the reality.
Exactly. We aren't just talking about abstract statistics. We are talking about the sheer, unfathomable amount of concrete poured, the asphalt laid, the millions of miles of plumbing installed, the electrical grids strung up.
All to make that urban migration possible.
Right. You are moving the population equivalent of multiple continents into high-density environments in a matter of decades.
And what's fascinating here is the underlying engine driving that migration and that physical growth. Because to understand why those cities were built so fast, you really have to look at the next slide. It zeroes in on one critical demographic metric: the age dependency ratio.
Okay, break that down for me. What exactly are we measuring there? Because that sounds like a very dry economic term.
Fair enough. The age dependency ratio is essentially a measure of the load a society is carrying. It calculates the number of dependents, meaning children who are too young to work, and elderly people who are too old to work, versus the number of working age adults.
Okay, that makes sense.
So 50 years ago, this ratio in LMYs was sitting at a staggering peak of 80.6%.
Wow. Meaning for every 10 adults who were actually in the labor force trying to generate wealth, there were basically 8 dependents needing food, education, healthcare, and support.
Exactly. And now let's look at the microeconomics of that for a second. Imagine a single household with 2 working parents and 6 children. Every single spare dollar that household generates goes into immediate survival.
Right, it goes into calories, basic clothing, maybe shelter.
Exactly. There is absolutely nothing left over to put into a savings account at the end of the month.
Because you're just treading water, you're just trying to keep everyone alive.
Precisely. Now scale that household up to an entire nation. When the national dependency ratio is 80.6%, the national savings rate is effectively 0. And if a nation has no savings in its banks cannot lend money to construction companies.
Oh, I see where you're going with this.
Right. They can't lend money to build factories or ports or apartment buildings. The economy cannot accumulate physical capital. It is stagnant.
But the chart on slide 4 shows that ratio just falling off a cliff. There's this red dashed circle highlighting the steep drop. It plummets from 80.6% all the way down to 54.3%.
And that drop is the ignition switch for the modern world. It created what economists call the demographic dividend.
Because suddenly the burden shifts.
The burden vanishes. When that ratio drops, it means you suddenly have an explosion of available labor. You have a massive, unprecedented army of young workers hitting their prime productive years, and they are having far fewer children than their parents did.
So going back to our household example.
Right, now you have 2 working adults, but maybe only 2 children. Suddenly, they actually have disposable income. They put that extra money into a bank. The bank now has capital.
And the bank lends that capital to a developer who builds a high-rise in the city.
Yes. And then the young adults move to the city to work in the businesses occupying that high-rise, generating more wealth, saving more money. It becomes this incredible virtuous cycle of capital formation and urbanization.
It's like a nation suddenly discovering a hidden reserve of energy. But instead of striking oil, they struck human hours.
That's a great way to put it.
But here's the thing that always trips me up when we talk about this massive workforce. For a labor force of billions to be economically productive, they first have to actually survive childhood. Like if you dump a billion sick, uneducated kids into a newly poured concrete city, you don't get an economic boom, you get a humanitarian crisis. And that brings us to the health miracle in part 2 of this report.
And this is where the data becomes incredibly poignant, because the demographic dividend we just talked about, it does not happen without a fundamental victory in public health.
Right. Looking at slide 5, we see this striking step-line chart. It shows a leap in male life expectancy at birth from a bleak 42.3 years to nearly 69.7 years.
It's a massive jump.
It's more than 25 years of human life added in a single half-century. But I actually have to ask a clarifying question here for you listening, because I know this trips up a lot of people.
Sure, what is it?
Wait, 42 years old. Were people in these countries literally dropping dead of old age in their early 40s? Like, was 42 considered an old man just 50 years ago?
I am so glad you asked that, because that is a very common misconception, and it's a crucial point to clarify. No, 42 is not considered old age. Biologically, human beings haven't changed.
Cool.
People who survived into adulthood in the 1970s often lived into their 60s or 70s, just like today. The reason the statistical average was dragged all the way down to 42.3 was because of extreme, catastrophic infant and child mortality.
Ah, so the math gets pulled down by the zeros and ones.
Exactly. If you have a society where one child dies at birth and another lives to be 84, their average life expectancy is exactly 42. So what you are seeing in this 25-year leap isn't the invention of anti-aging technology for adults.
Right.
You are seeing the cessation of mass child death.
And the overlapping area chart on slide 6 points directly to the weapon used to fight that death. It's vaccines.
Yeah, the immunization data is incredible.
It really is.
Yeah.
We see the baseline rates for childhood vaccinations 50 years ago were practically non-existent. For children aged 12 to 23 months, the DPT vaccine, that's diphtheria, pertussis, and tetanus, was sitting at roughly 10% coverage.
Barely anything.
And measles was at 7%. They were basically a rounding error. And then there's absolute explosion in coverage, skyrocketing to over 84% today. There's a specific arrow on the chart annotating this.
Right, pointing to the EPI, the Expanded Program on Immunization. When we talk about economic miracles, we always love to talk about trade deals or central banking or fancy technology.
Oh yeah, the sexy stuff.
Exactly. But the 25-year gain in life expectancy is heavily rooted in this specific, gritty public health victory. Cheap, scalable interventions that completely change the survival math for children.
But let's talk about the actual mechanics of that victory, because you see the vaccine rollout, and it sounds so clean and bureaucratic. But practically speaking, how do you get a measles vaccine to a remote village in the Congo, or the steppes of Central Asia, or the Amazon rainforest in the 1980s?
It was an absolute logistical nightmare. You have to remember, vaccines are biological products.
Right?
They have to be kept continuously cold, usually between 2 and 8 degrees Celsius, from the exact moment they leave the factory to the moment they are injected into a child's arm. This is what's called the cold chain.
And you are trying to maintain a cold chain across continents that don't even have reliable electricity grids.
Exactly. This wasn't just doctors walking around with syringes. It was an unprecedented triumph of international logistics. We are talking about kerosene-powered refrigerators.
Yeah, kerosene.
Yeah. It involved strapping solar-powered coolers to the backs of camels and off-road motorcycles. It involved thousands of local health workers navigating floods, deserts, and literal war zones just to keep vials of liquid cold. The sheer force of human will required to push those vaccination lines from 7% to 84% is staggering.
And the economic ripple effect of that is massive, right?
Oh, right.
Because it changes the entire psychology of the family.
Absolutely. Think about it. When child mortality is really high, families have more children as an insurance policy, hoping a few survive to support them in old age.
Right, you need hands for the farm and someone to take care of you.
But when you immunize the children and parents realize their kids are actually going to live, they stop having 6 or 7 children. They have 2 or 3. And crucially, they begin to invest heavily in the quality of those children's futures rather than just the quantity.
Which brings us perfectly to the next piece of the puzzle on slide 7. Because you've kept these children alive through the cold chain and the health miracle. But survival just isn't enough.
No, it's just the baseline.
Like I said earlier, if you move 1 billion uneducated kids into an urban center,
Yeah.
you just get poverty. To work in a modern urban economy, to participate in the new world, you have to be able to read.
Which is why the accumulation of human capital, specifically education, had to scale at the exact same time as the health interventions.
And the multi-line chart here is just as dramatic as the health data. Youth literacy, specifically for people aged 15 to 24, rises steadily from 70.4% to over 92.2%.
It's a beautiful trend line.
It is. But the true revelation in the data, the big reveal, isn't the overall number. I want to draw your attention to a gray oval at the end of the chart. It highlights the breakdown by gender.
Yes, the gender parity data.
Over this 50-year period, young female literacy just exploded. It rocketed from roughly 61% to over 91%, catching up almost completely to the male literacy rate. The lines almost touch inside that gray oval.
The gender gap was practically erased.
It's like a runner starting the race a full lap behind, but somehow finding a completely different gear and catching the leader right at the finish line.
And closing that gap represents one of the most profound socioeconomic shifts in human history. It isn't just a nice social metric. It is hardcore economics.
I want to dig into that.
Yeah.
Because from a purely ruthless macroeconomic perspective, we all agree that educating young women is a moral imperative, right?
Yeah.
It's a fundamental human right. But economically, why is that specific acceleration, the closing of the gender gap, so critical to the wealth of these nations? Why is it considered arguably the highest return on investment an emerging economy can make? Like higher than building roads or ports?
Because of the compounding multiplier effect. When you educate a young man, you gain a literate worker, which is great. But when you educate a young woman in a developing economy, you fundamentally alter the economic trajectory of multiple generations.
Walk me through that. How does it change the trajectory?
Okay, an educated woman marries later in life. She negotiates better wages in the formal economy. She manages household finances more efficiently, which directly increases that household savings rate we talked about earlier.
The savings rate that builds the cities.
Exactly. But most importantly, an educated woman exercises much greater agency over her own fertility. She chooses to have fewer, healthier children. And because she values education herself, she insists that her children, both sons and daughters, are also educated.
It creates a permanent feedback loop.
Exactly. Agitating young women takes the demographic dividend and locks it in. It ensures that the health miracle and the economic savings aren't just a temporary one-generation blip, but a permanent structural feature of the society. You alter household economics, you double your skilled workforce overnight, and you lower future birth rates. It is the ultimate economic lever.
Okay, so let's take stock for a second because the foundation is now built.
Yeah.
We have watched billions of people move from agrarian farms to newly built concrete cities. We have watched the dependency ratio plummet, unleashing a massive workforce.
Right.
We've seen that workforce survive childhood thanks to insane logistical feats like the global cold chain, and we've seen them achieve near universal youth literacy. So,
Mhm.
what happens to the money?
The wealth of generation phase?
Yeah, when all these healthy, literate people go to work, what does the actual wealth look like?
That brings us to part four, the economic takeoff, and a very surprising reality about how these countries actually grew.
Because when you look at the dashboard on slide 8, the macroeconomic data is almost schizophrenic. On one hand, you have the GDP growth rate, and the GDP line is bouncing wildly.
It's extremely volatile.
It's a severe, jagged zigzag. It hits 6%, then plummets to 4%, and during global shocks, it tanks below 3%. Looks like a seismograph during a major earthquake.
Yeah, it's not a comfortable ride.
But then, right alongside it, you have another metric, per capita GNI, or gross national income, based on purchasing power parity. And that line is a smooth, relentless, almost serene upward curve. It climbs from roughly $2,300 to over $15,000.
This juxtaposition is vital for you, the listener, to understand. The jagged GDP line tells us that the macroeconomic ride for developing nations is incredibly volatile. At the national level, they are constantly buffeted by global commodity prices, currency crises, and geopolitical shocks. They are small boats on a very stormy global ocean.
But the GNI line tells a different story entirely.
The smooth GNI per capita curve tells the deeper truth of the human experience inside those countries. Despite the macro-level chaos and the currency devaluations, the actual lived purchasing power of the average citizen expanded massively. Real wealth, the ability to buy food, shelter, and consumer goods increased nearly sevenfold.
Wait, I want to stop right there and explain purchasing power parity, or PPP. Because people hear that term thrown around in the news, but it's rarely explained well.
It can be a bit abstract, yeah.
How does PPP smooth out that jagged GDP line? How can a country's global GDP be tanking, but its citizens' purchasing power is going up?
Let's use a tangible example. Let's talk about getting a haircut.
Okay, I'm with you.
If you get a haircut in New York City, it might cost you $50. If you get the exact same haircut in Mumbai, it might cost you the equivalent of $3. Now, if the Indian rupee suddenly loses 20% of its value against the US dollar on the global currency markets, India's nominal GDP, when measured in US dollars, looks like it just took a massive hit.
It looks like the whole country got dramatically poorer overnight.
Exactly. But the guy in Mumbai still needs a haircut.
Right.
And the barber in Mumbai isn't importing his scissors from America, and he isn't paying his shop rent in dollars. He's operating entirely in the domestic economy. So the haircut still costs roughly the same amount of local labor and local resources.
Oh, I see.
Purchasing power parity adjusts the data to reflect what money can actually buy locally. It strips away the distortion of global currency markets.
So the smooth GNI PPP line proves that the domestic economies of these developing nations were becoming fundamentally stronger and more productive, even when Wall Street thought their currencies were crashing.
Precisely. They were generating real, localized wealth.
But how? Where did that wealth come from? Because this leads to slide 9, and what I consider the biggest surprise in the entire data set.
That's structural transformation.
Yeah. We've all grown up hearing the story of the developing world through a very specific lens. We picture factories, manufacturing, industrialization. We picture the Asian tigers, massive export processing zones, textile sweatshops, electronics assembly lines.
The classic industrial revolution model.
Right. We think of economic development as the factory phase. You move peasants into factories, they make cheap plastic goods, you export them, and eventually you move up the value chain to making cars and microchips.
But the data here tells a completely different story about where the jobs actually are.
The 100% stacked area chart tracks the relative makeup of the economy over 50 years across 3 sectors: agriculture, industry, and services. As expected, agriculture shrinks dramatically as people leave the farms.
Which we discussed with the urbanization flip.
Right. Industry, meaning manufacturing and factories, grows steadily, but it stays relatively contained. It never dominates the chart. The sector that absolutely balloons and takes over the entire economy is the service sector. There is literally a magnifying glass icon resting on the service sector in this slide.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, it completely turns traditional 19th and 20th century economic assumptions on their head.
I actually have to push back on this. Hold on. I cannot accept that billions of people just skip the factory phase entirely. How does an emerging economy survive just doing each other's laundry and selling street food? Don't you need to build physical things to build wealth?
It's a brilliant question, and your skepticism is exactly what traditional economists felt when they first started seeing this trend. To answer it, we have to look at the math of human beings versus the mechanics of modern factories.
Okay, lay it on me.
Remember the raw number from the very beginning. We added 4.5 billion people. Now think about the Industrial Revolution in 19th century Britain or early 20th century America. Those factories were incredibly labor-intensive. It took hundreds of men just to move steel beams around.
Right, it's all muscle.
So moving peasants into factories worked back then because the factories needed endless human muscle. But the developing world of the late 20th and early 21st centuries isn't building 19th century factories. They are building modern factories. And modern manufacturing is increasingly capital-intensive and automated. It relies on robotics, advanced machinery, and highly precise supply chains. Even the most massive, sprawling manufacturing hubs on Earth simply cannot physically absorb billions of newly urbanized workers. The factory floors do not have enough physical space, nor do they need that much human muscle anymore.
So the factories are there, generating absolute industrial value. They're building things, but the factories couldn't employ the sheer volume of the demographic dividend.
Exactly. So where did the rest of the people go when they arrive in the city? They have to survive, so they go into services.
But again, we aren't talking about them arriving in the city and becoming investment bankers or management consultants.
No, absolutely not. It starts as the informal service sector. It's the guy fixing bicycles on the corner. It's the woman running a street food stall. It's local transport, informal retail, domestic labor. It is highly precarious, low-wage work.
But how does that drive a sevenfold increase in national wealth? That sounds like a recipe for permanent urban poverty.
Because it doesn't stay informal. As the sheer density of the urban population grows, and as that population is now literate and healthy, the service economy rapidly formalizes. And it was massively accelerated by a technological leapfrog.
You're talking about the smartphone.
Exactly. Developing countries leveraged technology to leapfrog traditional industrial stages. They didn't spend decades laying copper landline telephone wires to every single house like the West did. They went from zero connectivity straight to mobile internet via cell towers.
Right, skipping a whole generation of infrastructure.
And the moment you put a cheap smartphone in the hands of a literate street vendor, you have instantaneous digital logistics.
The informal street food stall becomes a node on a digital delivery app. The guy with a motorbike becomes a formal logistics courier.
Yes. You get the explosion of mobile banking like M-Pesa in Kenya, which bypassed traditional brick-and-mortar banking entirely. You get massive domestic telecom networks, digital healthcare, local IT support, and eventually global business processing services. They didn't follow the Western blueprint of farm to factory to office. Millions went farm to city to smartphone. That is how the service sector became the dominant engine of wealth.
It's a profound paradigm shift. But here's where it gets really interesting, because not all of that massive, literate, healthy workforce found jobs in their new home cities or on their smartphones.
No, they didn't.
A huge chunk of them looked at the domestic economy, realized it couldn't absorb them, and they crossed international borders. Which leads us to part 5. The globalization hack.
And visually, if you look at the data on slide 10, this is the most aggressive, visually arresting trend in the entire half-century report.
It really is. It is a single, deep red, exponential curve tracking personal remittances. And the numbers are staggering. 50 years ago, the money sent home by migrant workers was barely a blip under $300 million. And then it curves upward with this violent, relentless velocity to peak at over $630 billion. billion with a B.
What's fascinating here is the profound macroeconomic impact of that 630 billion. For the listener, it is vital to differentiate remittances from other forms of international money, like foreign aid or foreign direct investment.
Right, because foreign aid is government to government. It's slow, it's heavily bureaucratic, and frankly, it's often subject to corruption or immense political conditions.
Yes.
And foreign direct investment, or FDI, goes to corporations to build bridges or factories. It doesn't go to the people.
But remittances are decentralized, direct to household, frictionless cash.
It's a guy working construction in Dubai, sending money directly to his mother's mobile phone in a village in Kerala. It's a nurse in London sending British pounds back to her family in Manila.
Exactly. And at 630 billion, it absolutely dwarfs foreign aid. But it's not just about families buying better food. From a macroeconomic perspective, remittances are arguably the most powerful stabilizing force in the developing world. They act as a massive counter-cyclical lifeline.
Explain countercyclical.
Think about the jagged GDP line we discussed earlier. Let's say a developing nation's local economy stumbles. Maybe a massive drought wipes out the agricultural sector or inflation spikes. Normally, the economy would go into a tailspin.
Right. People lose jobs, demand crashes.
But migrant workers living abroad see the trouble at home, and they react instinctively. They send more money to their families to help them survive. When the domestic economy goes down, remittances go up. They counter the cycle.
It keeps children in school and pays for medical care even when the local government is failing. But how does that help the country at a macro level? How does my uncle sending me $100 from Dubai help the central bank?
That is the brilliant mechanism of foreign exchange reserves. Let's trace that $100. Your uncle in Dubai earns dirhams, converts them to US dollars, and wires them to you. But you can't buy groceries at the local market with US dollars. You need the local currency.
Right, I need pesos or rupees.
So the local bank gives you $100 worth of the local currency, and the bank takes the US dollars. Those US dollars eventually flow up to the nation's central bank. Now, the central bank is sitting on a massive pile of US dollars.
Okay, I'm following.
Why does that matter? Because the central bank can use those US dollars to buy critical imports on the global market, like oil, medicine, or advanced machinery, which are almost exclusively priced in dollars.
So it funds the imports.
Furthermore, if the local currency starts losing value and causing inflation, the central bank can take that pile of US dollars, go into the currency markets, and literally buy back its own local currency, stabilizing the exchange rate. So the hard labor of migrant workers abroad directly provides the central bank with the financial ammunition it needs to defend the entire domestic macroeconomy.
So these countries essentially exported their demographic dividend, their excess labor, to the rest of the world and reaped the financial rewards via digital wire transfers. It is the ultimate globalization hack.
It really is.
But the story pivots incredibly hard right here in Part 6. We've been talking about miracles and dividends and hacks. But a half-century of exponential growth of this magnitude is never truly free.
No, it wasn't free at all.
It was heavily financed both financially and ecologically, and the bill is coming due.
And this is where the sobering reality of modern economic development sets in on slide 11. Because while remittances are powerful, they aren't enough to build megacities. Growth requires massive capital, and LMY growth is deeply addicted to external financing.
The data tracking public and private non-guaranteed debt is terrifying. We're looking at a serious stacked bar chart here. Over the last 50 years, debt levels have climbed relentlessly, and there's a terrifying red dashed line at the top marking a threshold, $8.9 trillion.
Nearly $9 trillion in external debt.
Just a staggering sum.
To pour the concrete, string the power lines, build the telecommunication networks, and fund the health and education systems, governments, and private corporations borrowed heavily from foreign lenders. And crucially, they borrowed in foreign currencies, predominantly US dollars.
And that is the trap, isn't it?
It is a profound macro-financial vulnerability. The sheer cost of servicing this nearly $9 trillion debt introduces severe fragility. Let's use an analogy to explain why borrowing in US dollars is so dangerous. Imagine you want to build a house, so you take out a massive multi-million-dollar mortgage. But the bank insists that your mortgage is priced in gold.
Okay.
But you don't earn gold. You are an apple farmer. Your salary is paid entirely in apples. For years, the price of gold is stable, so you know exactly how many apples you need to sell to pay your mortgage every month. You build the house, everything is great.
Sounds fine so far.
But suddenly, a crisis happens on the other side of the world, and the global price of gold triples overnight.
Even though I am still farming the exact same number of apples, my mortgage payment just ruined me.
Exactly. Your local economy hasn't changed. You didn't do anything wrong. But the terms of your debt changed underneath you. That is what it means to hold 8.9 trillion in US dollar denominated debt. When inflation hits the United States, the US Federal Reserve raises interest rates to fight it. When US interest rates go up, the value of the dollar surges globally.
The price of gold goes up.
Precisely. Suddenly, for a developing nation earning local currency, the sheer cost of just paying the interest on that 8.9 trillion debt skyrockets. The capital that should be going into schools, hospitals, and green infrastructure is instead being drained out of the country just to service foreign debt. If global interest rates sneeze, the developing world catches a cold.
They are walking an incredibly precarious financial tightrope. But it's not just a financial debt they've accumulated to build this modern world. The ecological bill is also on the table on slide 12, and the data here is perhaps the most tragic we've seen.
The expanding carbon footprint.
Here's where it gets really interesting. If you look at this dual-line chart tracking total GDP alongside total greenhouse gas emissions, excluding LULUCF over the last 50 years, they rise together in perfect, tragic unison. Emissions exploded from roughly 6,944 million tons to over 33,674 million tons. Per capita CO2 essentially tripled, going from 1.2 to 3.7 tons per person.
This chart proves what environmental economists call a strong coupling. Throughout this entire 50-year period, LMYs have simply not figured out how to decouple economic growth from carbon emissions.
It's a tragic trap. Every percentage point of GDP gained every child educated, every hospital built, every service sector job created required a corresponding increase in burning fossil fuels. It's like putting the entire economic boom of the last 50 years on a high-interest credit card, while simultaneously pumping the exhaust from your new car straight into your own living room. You are getting richer, but you're choking yourself to do it.
And the tragedy of the commons here is that developing nations are often burning this carbon just to reach the baseline standard of living that the West achieved a century ago.
Right, it's a fairness issue.
But the global atmosphere doesn't care about historical fairness. It only cares about total parts per million of carbon. And the environmental cost isn't just invisible gas in the air. This massive human expansion manifests in the dirt beneath our feet and the grid we rely on, which we see in Part 7.
Right, slide 13 brings us to the limits of the Earth itself. The data tracks arable land per capita, the amount of farmable land available per person. And the trend line is a simple, depressing descent. It shrinks by more than half, dropping from 0.31 hectares per person down to just 0.13 hectares.
Connect this back to the very first thing we discussed. We added 4.5 billion people to the planet. But the Earth didn't get any bigger. The amount of land suitable for farming is finite, and in fact, much of the best farmland was literally paved over by that massive urbanization wave we talked about. We built the cities on top of the farms.
So the math here is terrifying. How do you feed 6.5 billion people with half as much land per person?
You force the land to produce more. The only way to achieve the necessary crop yields on 0.13 hectares of land is through a massive systemic reliance on chemical fertilizers, specifically synthetic nitrogen.
Let's explain that, because I think most people don't realize how precarious our food supply actually is.
At the beginning of the 20th century, scientists invented the Haber-Bosch process. It is a method of taking nitrogen directly out of the air using massive amounts of heat and pressure, usually powered by natural gas, and turning it into synthetic ammonia fertilizer. Without the Haber-Bosch process, the Earth could naturally support maybe 4 billion people.
Meaning the lives of billions of people currently alive are entirely dependent on this chemical process.
Yes. It is arguably the only thing standing between the current global population and mass starvation. It's a tightrope walk for global food security.
Because it comes at a tremendous ecological cost.
Massive. Pumping that much synthetic nitrogen into the dirt degrades the soil microbiome over time. It causes huge runoff pollution that creates dead zones in the oceans. And, as we mentioned, it requires immense amounts of fossil fuels to produce.
So let's review the tab for this half-century of miracles. We have nearly $9 trillion in dollar-denominated debt. We have soaring... But then, there's an incredibly subtle shift in the data. For decades, non-hydro renewable energy, meaning solar and wind, sat completely flat at roughly 0.5% of the energy mix, just a flat line. But at the very end of the 50-year timeline in this inset chart, it suddenly spikes. It forms a sharp J-curve, shooting up past 11%.
That J-curve is the most optimistic data point we have. It highlights an important concept in development economics: the latecomer advantage.
What does that mean in practice?
For decades, developing nations couldn't afford solar or wind energy. It was expensive, experimental technology heavily subsidized by wealthy Western countries. If you were a poor nation trying to electrify a city, coal was the only mathematically viable option.
Right, you go with what's cheap and proven.
But now, the Western world paid the massive research and development costs. The economies of scale have been reached globally. Solar panels and wind turbines are now incredibly cheap. In many parts of the world, building new solar capacity is literally cheaper than building new coal capacity.
So they don't have to choose between development and the environment anymore. It is finally the economically rational choice to go green.
Exactly. Developing nations are beginning to adopt green technology at scale because it makes financial sense. This J-curve hints at a potential structural shift away from fossil fuels. Just as they skipped laying copper landlines and went straight to the smartphone, they might be able to build the next phase of their electrical grids without relying entirely on coal. They skip the 20th century grid and go straight to distributed renewables.
The latecomer advantage. But it has to happen fast because, as we've seen, the environmental and financial margins are razor thin. Which brings us to the outro, slide 15, the final summation. How do we pull all of this together? When you look at the entirety of this 50-year transformation, how do you categorize it?
Based on this final summary matrix, I think you have to view it through three distinct lenses: the success, the shift, and the risk.
Break those down for me.
The success is undeniable. These countries successfully translated a massive demographic boom into tangible wealth, closing the gender gap in education and securing a 25-year leap in human lifespan through heroic public health efforts.
Yeah, the health and literacy gains are incredible.
Then, the shift defines the mechanics of how they did it. By moving populations from subsistence farms into globalized cities and bypassing traditional factories to build mobile-powered service economies supported by $630 billion in remittances.
And the risk is the shadow of that success.
The risk is existential. They are teetering on the edge of an $8.9 trillion debt cliff, highly vulnerable to Western interest rates, and they're pushing against an environmental redline, shrinking arable land, and skyrocketing carbon emissions.
Which means the overarching conclusion of this data is that the next 50 years cannot simply look like the last 50. The model has to change.
Economists frame this as the necessary transition from extensive growth to intensive growth.
Give me the quick ELI 5 on that.
Extensive growth means you grow an economy simply by adding more raw inputs. You add more people to the workforce, you burn more coal, you borrow more money, you plow more land. It's growth by sheer volume. But as we've seen, the LMYs have hit the wall on extensive growth. The land is shrinking, the carbon budget is blown, and the debt is maxed out.
So what is intensive growth?
Intensive growth means you grow through efficiency and innovation. You don't burn more coal, you invent better solar panels, you don't plow more land, you develop drought-resistant crops. You grow not by adding inputs, but by increasing total factor productivity, getting more output from the exact same inputs through smarter technology and better human capital.
And that is the perfect pivot to the final thought I want to leave you, the listener, with today. We started this deep dive by looking at how the demographic dividend, that massive, unprecedented explosion of young, cheap labor, built the modern developing world. It was the ultimate engine of extensive growth.
It was.
But here is the catch. That demographic dividend is fading. Because of the very successes we talked about, surviving childhood, women's literacy, urbanization birth rates in these countries are dropping rapidly. Those young workers who built the megacities 50 years ago are getting older. Populations of the developing world will soon begin to age.
It's a huge demographic shift.
So here is the provocative question you need to mull over as you watch the global news or track the markets. Can these countries successfully make the jump to intensive growth? Can they invent new high-productivity industries, fundamentally rebuild their energy grids into green networks, and pay off $8.9 trillion in debt? Yeah. Without the endless supply of cheap young labor that got them to this point in the first place. Essentially, can a developing economy afford to get old before it gets fully rich? That is the defining economic tension of our time, and it is the most important story for you to keep a very close eye on as this next half-century begins.
It is going to be a fascinating, highly consequential transition to watch.
It really is. Until next time, keep diving deep.